into our internal visceral experience and have contact with what's happening kind of within our viscera to maybe inform where we're at. And so just as I introduced with the orientation exercise, for a lot of patients, especially those that might have a trauma history, sensations might be a channel that is a no-go for quite some time, right? It might be a difficult channel to access initially. But sometimes, just so that they can have a perspective and the assurance that their nervous system still is working properly, sometimes I'll introduce sensation for maybe someone with complex trauma through the routes that we tend to really be able to easily access sensation, and that is in our aches and pains. So how many of you don't have to show hands, of course, but how many of you, like when you roll up out of bed, the first thing that you can notice is like a kinky neck, or a sore back, right? Or something that just feels a little off, right? Oh gosh, maybe like especially those that slept in the hotel last night and you're not used to your comforts, you don't have your own pillow, your own stuff. Maybe you notice some of those the physiological elements of some discomfort. And so that can actually be a helpful route to sometimes when someone says, I just don't know where my sensations are. I have no idea. I am not a walking, breathing, sensing person. Sometimes that can be a nice intro. Well, maybe we're not able to notice all of our sensory elements, but we can probably hone in on some of the places where we might notice some discomfort, right? It can kind of be a playful exercise. But I also give people the opportunity to have a range, right? Because sometimes when people have that daunting task, right, when they're looking across from you as a practitioner and you say, hey, where are you sensing that? That might be too much, right? It might be too far away from some of the channels that they utilize and implement. And so I like to give scaling questions, such as, where in your body do you notice it feeling a little bit more pleasant? Where is it unpleasant? And where is it a little bit more neutral, right? Because again, we're just then maybe dipping some toes into how to get some language around what's happening in our internal experience. So image is the I in SIBAM, and as you've probably noted already, image is one of my favorite channels. It's one also that when I began my somatic journey was the least accessible to me. I would say through all of the letters that I'll go through, being a cognitive behavioral practitioner by trade and by history, the language of image just was out of reach. It wasn't a language that I spoke fluently. And now I would say between that and sensation, they are my chief channels that I use in the room with patients. And so it's just a beautiful way in which, and to conceptualize how I mean image here, is that sometimes if you've ever been sitting across from a patient and they might say something and it reminds you of someone, right? That is an example of a spontaneous image, right? Or if you get to talking and maybe if a patient across from you actually speaks the language of image, they may talk in a lot of story, right? I love when I'm sitting across from people that are great storytellers and they can set up a scene as though I'm there with them. That is a person that likely has a very healthy and accessible image channel, right? Because they can talk in those details that can really implant you right into that place, right? Image for trauma survivors is sometimes a closed off channel because often images in that fragmented way, if they are in kind of access to image, sometimes they might have access to disturbing images, right? And so sometimes when people are suffering from nightmares or flashbacks, they want no part of image. But I'm really, with slow pacing and time, really trying to encourage this is actually a route in which the greatest healing can emerge. Because images are unconscious, right? It hasn't been harmed yet, right? There's a lot there that we can really work with and work from in order to implement some healing. But sometimes it can be a really difficult road to cross because there can be understandably a lot of fear attached. Behavior in SIBAM is a little different than you would assume. And this took a little while for me as an SEP to really wrap my mind around. Because again, I just called upon my roots as a CBT therapist. Oh, surely behavior just means the way that we're behaving through and through our life and our world. But actually, behavior in SIBAM is really an indication for the practitioner to really be honed in on what are some of the little tiny behaviors that might be giving that practitioner signals that maybe we're heading into a healing area, Or that we might, as you were inquiring about with the freeze question, that we might actually be heading straight into a freeze and immobility response. So with behavior, we're going to be looking at what we call in SE micro movements. So we're going to be looking at different ways that somebody might be seated, that they might be moving their hands or their limbs. We might even be looking at things like a change in flushness or kind of blood flow to the face, right? When I notice those times when I can catch it, and if I see a patient go offline, there's actually a whiteness that happens in the face. The reason for that is maybe their fight or flight has really taken on, it's kicked over a threshold into some immobility, and all of that blood has left the face and has gone into their heart. Because that is what our fight and flight does, right? It takes all of that blood flow and it brings it central so that if we really need to move or if we need to fight, we have enough blood to do so, right? So we're trained as SAPs to really be tracking and noticing some of these behaviors so that at times if we need to intervene, we can, or at times they can really inform where our work is going, right? I might have sometimes, and this actually was introduced to me as recipient of an SE session. I got the pleasure of actually in my year 2 getting to be a participant with the lead practitioner because the year 2 we were working on car accidents and shock traumas. And I happened to be in a car accident about 6 months prior. And so one of the behaviors that just spontaneously emerged when I was in that session on stage in front of 70 people, no pressure, but I did raise my hand, so I knew what I was getting into. So one of the behaviors that happened where hands came to this posture. This was introduced to me as an archetypal position. And so when I started to come into contact with that, when I was introduced to that in that session work, I was asked, what are some things that you're noticing from a sensory perspective as your hands are here? Now mind you, I had no idea consciously that as we were talking, my hands came here. The practitioner actually had to highlight this for me. It was that unconscious. And it's pretty remarkable that sometimes we can think, I mean, you would assume, right, something this obvious out in front would be something that our consciousness would have awareness of. It didn't. And when I've had patients come here, just on their own, spontaneously in session, and I've asked them to just pause with that. Let's take a notice of what's happening with your hands. Let's really notice, what are some images, what are some thoughts that come to mind as your hands are here? Things like feeling at home come up. Things like feeling grounded, feeling seen and centered, feeling as though God is present, right? So those are quite literally transcended symbols and signals that come in from our body here. And a little cute story that I have about this archetypal spontaneous movement. When my son was about 2 years old, it only lasted for about 2 weeks. But I had told my husband about this because it was such a powerful discovery that I made in that session. And our son, at about 2 years old, just started doing this all the time. He was just doing it around the house. He'd be in the bathroom and he would just be here. It was so cool. So of course I got a picture of it because as an SE, it's like, this is real, and this is happening. This is a way that our nervous systems quite literally know how to regulate themselves.
If you ever do like Tai Chi, I teach Tai Chi practice, the ball. That's why I was asking about the free, it's the Tai Chi coming into center and coming down into your hara.
Yep,
yeah.
There it is.
Yeah.
Right? And if we had more time today to really go into the depths of some of these different historical practices, a lot would have similarities of different movement energy, absolutely. Affect in SIBAM refers to embodied affect. So remember, we don't feel things out here, we feel them within our nervous systems. And so this may be, again, a channel that for a lot of people may be off limits. And sometimes that is actually quite natural. Especially for a younger population, my children, like if I'm trying to really train and model for them articulation of feelings, it's not an easy practice, right? And it's hard. We actually learn through a lot of careful modeling and learning how to call things certain feelings, right? And so just think, if we didn't have that modeling, if we didn't have those teachers to name what mad is, to name what sorrow is, to name what glee is, then sometimes we may just not have that language. And so I really like to free up patients when they're sitting across and they're like, I don't know what I'm feeling, you tell me what I'm feeling, right? What I will often do is I will seek out some of my own affective channels. What am I noticing in the room, right? It's why, you know, how we've heard that framework, you know, we can walk into a setting and if somebody's just gotten bad news, we can kind of feel that vibe, right? We can feel that vibration if they just, you know, heard something really hard. And so we can really call upon ourselves. If our patients or any of these channels are having a hard time articulating, it doesn't mean that our nervous system is offline, right? Quite the opposite. And so sometimes we can also reflect on what language we would use. Gosh, well, while I'm hearing that, I'm feeling this, right? And we can then hold it up and see if it's a match for what they're maybe trying to articulate. And then last but not least, meaning. And so meaning, and it's funny that this model is languaged this way, probably because just for ease of reference, but a lot of times there's little, what I like to say, like our AKAs, right? So meaning, AKA thoughts, right? So cognitions. So that's another way to think about meaning. I would say, especially in higher acute settings, and for a lot of patients when they hear this from me, they feel really assured. They don't feel like broken patients any longer. Meaning channels are, and that thinking channel is often the easiest to access, especially when there's been trauma. Because it's conscious. We can constantly be kind of in like that thought loop of our mind. And so there is an element of our thinking, and we're all guilty of this, I certainly am, right? As a recovering perfectionist, there is a thinking pattern that allows us to believe, okay, I'm in charge here. I actually have some say in this, right? I see what's happening here. So a lot of times, for mood, for trauma, for some of our very classic presentations, thinking is going to be a